Oh, I've got my laptop volume on. Let's not do that. Good start. Hey, what is up? Welcome to Adobe Live. I'm here with Jeremy Lord. I'm a bit rusty. This is our first live stream of the year. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Super excited to be here. First one of the year.
You are always the first cab off the rank. Very excited to be back in the saddle with you. We've come up with what we think is like a pretty cool brief to kind of follow. We're going to go through a couple of things, and obviously get stuck into some illustration super soon. Happy New Year, I guess. I know it's the 19th of January, but we haven't seen you guys for a long time. Hey, Johanna, Dee is in the house. Great to see you again, Dee, and Festus, of course. Great to see you too. Hope you guys are having a great start to the year, and let's hang out. We're here for an hour. 55 minutes, so I better shut up in a minute. But Jeremy, quickly, what have you been up to? How's everything going this year?
So far, so good. Just been, kind of pretty much the same, really, for me. Just lots of illustration, fair bit of work. Trying to transition, actually, into doing more murals as well. So,
saw that on your Instagram.
Get away from the computer. Yeah. Super fun, really kind of a bit of a new medium as well to try and master with spray paints. But, really enjoy it. So kind of trying to see how my digital work can then go onto a mural and what kind of clients that's going to go for. So a bit scary, but also super exciting.
Yeah, that's super cool. Hey, R&B is in the house as well. Great to see you there. So today we thought that we would do a two-part series. This is actually the kind of model we're planning on doing sort of for the rest of the year or for the foreseeable future, where what we're going to do is we're going to do a two-part episode where on a Tuesday and sometimes on a Wednesday we'll get an artist to come in and we'll do sort of part one, and then we'll get them to come back on, say, the Thursday or the Friday, and they'll do a part two. So there's always going to be kind of two sessions with each guest, which we always really like, because then we can kind of take on your feedback, and based on a lot of the questions that we'll get in chat, we can kind of adapt a little bit on the second time if we really want to try to keep that interactivity sort of thing going, which we love as well. So throw in your questions, say hello, let us know where you guys are. Yes, it is Jessica. It is t-shirt weather here for sure. It's been really hot. We're both in Sydney. Shorts and t-shirts over here. I'm assuming that it is cold where you are. So we've actually written a brief. We're going to follow a brief. So there should be some questions coming up from this. So Jeremy, I don't know if you want to bring up the brief that we have created. If you're watching this over on YouTube, jump over to Behance if you want to say hello. That's the chat that we're using today. And I'm going to jump over to Jeremy's screen. We have a brief, and to give Jeremy a break, I'm going to read it out in case you can't read it on your screen. Ignore the fact that it came from me. Yes, it is a fake brief. So Jeremy's been contacted. This is a very kind of typical thing that will happen to Jeremy or an artist that has a particular style. Even if you're a designer and you have a particular style, you might get this kind of emails coming through. We're contacting you from Shomida Gaming. We're creating an MMO that is currently in development, and we need some artwork to promote our upcoming game. We love your art style as it fits perfectly with the genre and aesthetic of our game, Ellipse Online. We're looking for some cool cover illustration artwork. We found the following on your website that we really like, and there's a couple of examples there. So some of Jeremy's ones, the top two and the one on the right. And then I'll need you to go back over so I can read the rest of the brief, unless you want to get stuck into that. We also have some examples from other artists that we also think fit. We have some examples over there, the one on the left and the one down the bottom. So these people said, yep, this kind of fits with our aesthetic as well. We need final artwork in the next few weeks. It's always a vague and arbitrary deadline. We just kind of need it. If you're interested, it'd be great to chat and talk about the project. Please let us know if there are any questions. All right, Jeremy, you get these emails all the time. What do you do?
Okay, so as it stands, yeah. So definitely, usually you get an email. Every now and then you get a phone call, which I would invariably just throw back to an email. But long story short, yes, you get an email. As it stands, as far as kind of email first contact briefs go, it's a bit of a kind of a balancing act for clients, because obviously, if you like, they don't want to reveal everything about their company and the brief that they're doing, especially if it's some like sort of bigger clients, like if you're working for like Adobe or Sony or Microsoft or any of those kind of things, they're not going to tell you what they're working on because you haven't agreed to do the thing yet. So it's a bit of a tightrope act of just like, how much can we tell you that you know enough that you may or may not be able to agree to do the brief. So as far as kind of these kind of briefs go, this is actually a pretty solid brief. Like, I've got a fair bit of information here. I would usually ask clients to give me this. It actually very rarely happens, which is why this is a good brief as it stands. That like I would ask clients to show me examples of what they're thinking. Often what you would get is this idea that it's like, oh, we like your aesthetic, but there's a range of things happening in my aesthetic. Are you talking cyberpunk? Are you talking Japanese? Are you talking a bit of both? Are you talking 80s? Like, what are we looking at here? And so I would generally ask them to find examples of what they have in mind rather than try and describe it. Describing it's never really a good thing, because it's like, it's kind of like, a little bit retro, a little bit, this is like, retro means basically like anything from like the 2000s down to like the 1850s or even further could be considered retro. So, or, like clients will use words like make it cool or make it trendy, and it's just, I don't know what that means in your brain.
Yeah, just 10% more grunge, bit of grit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's always, I think first step is always like, don't give me words, give me images of what you're thinking. And then I can say like, okay, so when you say like retro, you actually mean this. And that's cool, that's fine, but at least now I know. So that would be step one, which you've very kindly already done, given me examples of that kind of stuff. So the first kind of thing as well, like you've already told me what you're kind of thinking of. So we want an illustration, right? So we're looking for a cool cover artwork. So that's a fair bit of detail. A lot of times clients will just be like, we like your style, we're looking for an artwork. So the question then is always, what's the scope of work? What do you actually need me to do?
Right?
Are we talking about, in this case, obviously we're talking about a cover illustration. Are we talking about, and we'll get to usage in a sec, but do you want one illustration? Do you want two illustrations? Do you want the illustration plus the time-lapse process of it because you're going to promote it and put it on your website? All these kind of different things. Like, what are you actually after? And sometimes this actually is this can actually lead to more work from that client, because if it's a brief that you're really hanging on to, so for instance, on something like this, you're asking for a cover illustration. So my question would be, a cover for what?
Right.
Because a cover illustration is, what is it, a cover for a magazine? Is it a cover for a pitch document, PDF slides? What's the kind of the output of this? What do you need me to do? And then in saying those kind of things, clients will be like, oh yeah, actually I didn't think about that. I didn't think about making like a poster out of this. We were just thinking of having it on like the box art or something. But yeah, some stickers for this would be really rad too. I didn't think about that. So often asking that question will lead to potentially more work, which obviously means a little bit more kind of usage for you and a little bit more money as well. But on a brief that you really enjoy, these kind of things can be super fun to do. So that would be question one. What do you actually need me to do? And that's what we call scope of work. Question two, and this is always a really important one, is what's the usage for this? So this is something that you haven't touched upon in this. Obviously, again, all this is like pretend, so this is intentional. Flynn's obviously left some gaps in this brief to make room for me to ask some questions like this. But
thanks.
This is
Give me the credit.
you would
I can write a brief.
This is very typical of what you would see is some clients don't necessarily understand what usage rights are. Others haven't necessarily thought that far or haven't gotten approval from the client, which is another question that you can kind of ask as well. A side question is, who's the client? So in this case, you run Shimada Gaming, so you're the client. But in some cases, if you're working through an agency, and the agency's been contacted by the company to do a wider range of like a style guide or something to design a logo for the game or whatever else, and then that agency commissions me, the illustrator, to just do the cover art and not touch the logo or anything. So if you look at this example, for instance, here, like obviously we've got the Cyberpunk 2077 logo. Typically on a brief like this, like I would be commissioned to do just this illustration, but maybe an agency's been commissioned to do that. So they handle that. I don't have to worry about that. So who's the actual client? Who am I working for here? Am I working for the person who's briefing me, or are they getting the brief from somewhere else? That's a different thing that we can do. So sometimes we'll get this thing. I'm just going to jump into Photoshop while I talk and kind of walk and talk at the same time, so we can kind of get the ball rolling. But yeah, you would definitely have to know what the usage rights are. So, for instance, what's going to be, if you're talking about a art, for instance, right? Like, how many countries are you going to sell that in? How long is the game going to be on shelves for? If it's a poster, for instance, like, are you giving this out to media partners? Is this a freebie that you're handing out? Are you going to be selling it at a big video game conference and therefore making money off of it? Is this going to be worldwide, or is it just going to be local in the city that the studio's in? All these things have a huge impact on the usage rights. The more you use the image, the more you have to pay for it, right? Yeah. If you're only using it once or printing like 5 t-shirts, that's not a lot. But if you're going to use it again and again and again forever, then that's going to represent quite a bit of money. So there's usage rights in that sense. Is it full usage rights? You just want to buy the artwork outright and you don't have to worry about what happens in the future? Or do you just want to rent out the artwork?
Yeah. Is that common, the first version? I would imagine if it was me, if I, and it is, I guess, in this case, I feel like, well, okay, cool. How much is it for us for it to be ours? Like once it's done and we sign off on it and we have whatever the deliverables are, and it's like, cool, we can make stickers, we can put it on a skateboard, it's ours now. Is that common?
It's usually pretty common for slightly bigger agencies, simply because, or clients, simply because full usage rights is a little bit more expensive.
Yeah.
Because you're buying the artwork outright, and so for all intents and purposes, legally, you now own this artwork. I can't use it for anything else. Not that you would in a lot of cases. Like for instance, if I'm on this brief, if I'm creating, if I'm drawing from a character that you've created, then I'm never going to be able to reuse that illustration for another client, because that is specific to you. So there is, some of those things, but I generally find that, it's full usage rights tend to be the go, just because clients like to just be able to just go, like, we don't want to have to worry about it and we don't want to have to contact you. So we'll just get full usage rights off of you, and then that's easy, which makes my life a lot easier as well for the purposes of costing something like that. Because as soon as you get into things like, all right, so it's going to be online, and online is this much of the cost of doing it. Then we're also going to have it in 3 countries for a period of 6 months. So you got to tally all that up. It starts to get a little bit complicated when you talk about, partial usage rights. Yeah. So generally I would say that if you can get full usage rights, obviously you're going to be better off kind of financially, but there's also going to be this idea that it's just going to be easier for you to cost up something like that. Yeah. And then obviously you can also ask about kind of timeline. So what's the time frame? You've given me that. So in the next couple of weeks, but that's pretty loose.
It's pretty vague, isn't it?
Yeah. So then the question comes back to, and it's a good idea to work backwards. So you're talking about cover illustration. So I'm assuming here that you're talking about the cover of the box, like the actual game box that it ships in, the game will ship in. This is what you're doing, right? So then your game is shipping when? So let's say that it ships like in 6 months. You probably need like a month. I'm making this up, but you probably need a month to, get all that shipping done worldwide, which means you need the boxes to be done. So you work kind of backwards from the date that it needs to be in the customer's hands.
And these are the sort of things like you said you were assuming this, but when you're assuming something, it's something that you would reverse back to the client, right? You'd say, cool, hey, so I need to know. I need to know this to be able to get back to you and say yes or no. Look at your schedule, what's going on. Think about usage rights. Tell them a quote or an estimate, all that sort of stuff.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it is not your job to figure out the timeline for the client.
Right.
Like that's their job. They got to figure all that stuff out and come back to you and say, we need the artwork at the latest by then, because we need to kind of figure out everything else that goes with it. And then you have your timeline. And then last but not least of the questions that we can kind of talk about is budget. Clients will always, clients are always going to try and obviously get the work for as little as possible, I guess. And saying that, there are clients out there. I have had this happen to me before, where I've quoted for a job and the client's gone, well, we actually have more to give you on something like this, and we really want you to do a good job. So we're gonna see your quote and raise you. Which it's pretty rare, but when that happens, that's pretty awesome. Generally speaking, it's pretty rare that a client will come to you and say, we have X amount of budget for this. What can you do? The general consensus is, if you do that, then obviously the illustrator, like if you come to me and say, we've got $2,000 to do this, if that's a reasonable thing, then I'm going to say, well, I'll take all of those $2,000. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm never going to look at it and go, well, actually, I'll take less.
No, that would be madness.
Well, yeah. I mean, within reason, obviously. Like if you're asking me just for a small thing, like, you want to do the right thing and just be like, look, sorry, that's just not worth that much. But yeah, so generally speaking, clients will try and put that question back on you. If you ask them, they will just go like, all right, well, will you give us an estimate, and then we can work from there, which is fair enough. But it's also a little bit tricky, because there's different levels of things that I can do with something like this. So if we're getting into the sketches here, so I've started kind of drafting up these sketches, right, based on the brief that you've given me. Some of them are super, super loose. Right? So number 8 here is super loose. And by the way, numbering these when you're doing this is insanely important, because if you don't number these, when you're getting feedback from the client, they're looking at like, all right, so on the one on the bottom, underneath the 4th one on the top from the left, it's like, no, that's not working, right? Sure. So if you put a number 8 on it, they can just say, number 8 with like the hairdo from number 5, and the sword from number 1, and that just makes life a whole lot easier for you and the client. So numbering those up is really good. But to come back to what I was talking about before, some of these sketches, like something like number 2, for instance, is relatively simple. Like I've done the sketch in a little bit more detail. But if you came to me and said, look, again, making this up, I've got like $1,500 to do this. For $1,500, I could do this, right? If you're asking me for like full length kind of illustration with heaps of detail and a background and some type and everything else, like number 1, I can't do that for $1,500. So if a client kind of, and I think that's important to remember, if you give a quote to a client, or if a client is kind of trying to haggle with you, that's okay, because you can just say, look, like this one here is worth like $3,000. Okay, so you don't have that budget? Well, then I can do something like this. I can do simpler. Like I can work to your budget. It doesn't have to be, no, that's not enough. I'm not doing this brief. It's more to the point of like, all right, well, what can I do for the money that you do have? So then we kind of look at all this kind of stuff and just assess that and come up with a figure based on all of the things that we just kind of covered. So time frame, the faster, the shorter amount of time you have, the more it's going to cost. I always use this kind of holy trinity of invoicing and quoting, which you've probably seen before on multiple kind of design websites. And it's this kind of triangle of like cheap, fast, and good. And you can only ever have 2. Right? So if it's cheap and good, you're going to take your time. It'll be slow. If it's fast and cheap, it's not going to be good.
Yep.
Or if it's fast and good, you're going to have to pay for it, because that means I'm really good. So I always go from the assumption that you always want to assume that this one is going to be one of the things, because you never want to do bad work intentionally.
Yeah.
So then from there, it's just this thing of like, all right, well, I can do really good work. You don't have a lot of money, then it's kind of like it'll be ready when it's ready, and you don't get to dictate when that is.
Yeah.
I'll just do it when I have nothing else to do. And if you want good and fast, then obviously you need to pay for it. So that's, I think, always a really kind of interesting way of looking at it. And then with all of this as well, the final question that I would ask is, your game has it been built already?
No, this hasn't been built. No, this is like super early. It says it's still in development.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't have a character for me to work on. You don't want me to draw one of your characters. You want me to come up with a completely different character on its own.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's that early. Yeah. I think it's that early in the piece that they have like a title and a name, and they've probably got a long development process, but they need something. They need some aesthetic to kind of represent kind of what they're thinking for whatever purposes that you would ask them for in an extra question.
Okay, so then I usually break down my things into 3 parts. First, there's concepts, right? So in this instance, you're asking me to come up with a concept for a character, create a character from scratch. If you had a character already existing, then I wouldn't be charging you for this, because I don't have to, like, I still have to come up with the idea and composition for the illustration, but that falls under the next one, which is execution. Right? So that's me actually making the artwork. So are you paying me for an idea as well? Not so much, because you've already got the idea, you just don't know how to do the drawing of it. So that's my job. And then there's usage, which is the sort of a rough way of looking at all of those things. So for instance, you could have any one of those things happen in something. So we've already designed a character. We just need you to do the execution and the usage. Right? Or we have artists who are able to draw stuff, and we want it to be in our style, but we really like the themes and concepts that you work with. So can you just do the concepts, and then we'll pay you for the usage, but you're not doing the execution? That's pretty rare, but it can happen. Or it's an artwork that you've already done. So for instance, like something like this, right, which I just do for myself, that's personal. You might look at that and go, that's perfect. That's exactly what we needed, actually. No changes required. Can we just have that artwork? And then you're only paying me for usage. You're not paying me for the concept and execution, because you didn't brief me on that. You're just paying me for the right to use that artwork. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So in this instance, you would be in for all 3 of those, because you're actually asking me to come up with an idea, then execute it, and then obviously you're going to use it. So those 3 things would compound to give me the quote.
Cool. I really like that way of thinking about it. That's really cool.
Yeah, it just makes life a bit easier. And obviously there's a lot of gray areas, as always with invoicing and quoting. It's not an exact science. It's definitely a bit more of an art form. But yeah, so all right, so we've got our brief. I've gone away and I've done hours and hours and hours and hours of sketch. I've, blood, sweat, and tears has gone into this page. And obviously we come back and we sit down and we go, all right, here's what I've got. So I've got a whole bunch of sketches. And like I said, some of them are relatively loose. You want to keep it relatively rough here, because, you don't want to spend hours finishing something off only to have the client go like, no, I don't like it. What else you got? So you want to explore a range of different ideas and show a good range of kind of different poses or different themes. Some of them are very kind of, again, loose and leave a lot to the imagination. Others are a lot more kind of straightforward and just go like, okay, I can see exactly what's happening here. But the idea, again, is that the client will go like, I like number 2 because I like the profile and how all the tubes go in, and we can kind of see something a little bit more like soulful. It's maybe a little bit darker, or you know what, I want something with a little bit more sass, a bit more attitude. So can we have the visor and the hairdo from number 2 and stick it on the girl from number 3, or those kind of things. So that would be the kind of rounds of feedback that would happen here. Obviously, you want to show more than 1. You probably want to show more than 2. I'd say anywhere in between 3 and like 10 to 15, depending on how productive you are, is good.
Mm-hmm.
There is such a thing as too many thumbnails, where you're giving the client too much choice, and then that's just confusing for them, and then they just lose their marbles and just go like, I don't know anymore, there's just too much here.
Well, and also if there's multiple people going through it, if you've got like you know 30 to choose from, then no one's ever going to pick the same one, right? And you're going to end up in they're going to be arguing with each other, and then they're never going to get back to you, or you're going to say, oh, we can't really decide, and you end up kind of back at square one with no direction.
Yeah, there's that, but and there's that, and it's absolutely true. And then there's also the fact that you, at the end of the day, are a design consultant. You're a creative consultant, and your job is to curate this. Like a little bit like a waiter would be, you know, like, oh, I don't recommend that wine with that meal. All right, well, you tell me what I should do. Like, I think a lot of people forget to do that as creatives. They just go like, whatever you want, client, I defer to you. I think it's a very good thing, and most clients are quite thankful for it if you do tell them like, this isn't going to work. Like, for instance, I would recommend, in this instance, I would recommend number 3 a little bit, because obviously I've worked on that for this live stream, but something like number 2 is good. But my experience on something like a profile piece like this is that because it's profile, you're not going to be able to get as much detail in, and there's not going to be a lot of depth that's going to happen. So for instance, if I wanted to do something that I do quite often and add in like demon horns on a profile, you only just see one. It's not
like a unicorn.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's a bit weird, right?
Yeah.
So something like that I would not necessarily recommend. If the goal is to get a lot of like details and stickers and patches and all that kind of stuff, then a profile is not really going to cut it. Something like number 4 here is also not really going to cut it, because the arms are coming in and hiding most of the torso. And that means, you know, any design that's on the t-shirt or anything will be hidden. It becomes a little bit tricky to do. So I would go in and say, I don't recommend these ones. I did them just because it's stream of consciousness, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you go for one of these ones, simply because, you know, if you want your logo on the t-shirt of the character on something like this, it's not going to show very well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Whereas something like this, we've got a full if she's wearing a t-shirt or something, like, we can really put a big design on that, and that's going to be front and center. We can see a fair bit of the body. That's a good pose to kind of go for, and that's the kind of stuff that your client's not necessarily going to know,
for sure,
and that they'll be thankful for you to come in and say, you know, I recommend something like this. Something like this one, for instance, is good for like this part of it, because we can see a lot of stuff, but we can't really see her face. So that takes out a lot of the attitude that can be brought, and expression that can be brought into a piece like this. So yeah, I would definitely sort of recommend, you know, go for something like this. That would be my recommendation. But obviously if the client says, no, we want number 5, then of course you do that.
Yeah.
But it's good to just come in and give your recommendation.
That's cool. Hey, I've got a question. We can assume that the client chose number 3, if you like, and we can go from there. But so Steve has a good question. Jeremy, have you ever asked a large group of like decision makers to please nominate one contact person to convey decisions to you, instead of having to listen to debates every time?
I've never had to ask that, but there's definitely been times where that has been something that the agency has decided, look, we're going around in circles here, we just need to nominate one person. But usually when you're working with an agency, there's an art director or a design director who calls the shots at the end of the day. It's where the buck stops, and they will be the one to make that call. But you know, in saying that as well, it's a good question, and it's an interesting scenario, and it's one that comes up relatively often, of the kind of lack of decision, or like too many chefs in the kitchen, or too many differing opinions. I've had that happen actually more often to me from working with just one person than working with a team. Because if you're working with one person, they're generally just a private contractor who just have their own business, and so they're a lot closer to it, and therefore the decision making is a lot harder because it's their baby. They're a lot more involved in it. Whereas if you're working with an agency and there's an art director there, they can be a little bit more kind of clear-minded and a little bit more ruthless with what's going on, and say, look, you know what, this is the one that we're going to go for, because timing, or because not possible to do another one, or because whatever reason it is, this is the one we've chosen. So Yeah, but there definitely has been times where it's, you know, in this idea of like, you got to make a decision. And this is where your quoting and your rounds of changes come in. Like, you don't want to be working eternally for free, obviously, and like keep making changes for a client that just can't make up their mind. So having rounds of changes included into your quote is going to be really important, because it prevents you from having to do that free work. And just keep making eternal changes to a piece until the client figures out that they're happy with it or not. All the while you're making changes, and that's work on you when you originally quoted something and the client's not going to understand why, you know, when I ordered this, it said this much and now I'm getting the bill and it's this much. I don't understand.
Yeah.
Well, it's because you kept sending it back to the kitchen. Well, yeah, but you didn't say anything about that. I just thought that I would be allowed to do that.
Yeah.
Which is a silly comment, but it's one that happens nonetheless. And so you need to really cover yourself for something like that.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're at phase 2, where we've got the sketch that we chose, which was number 3, or the sketch that I made you choose for the purposes of the stream, which was number 3 in that pose.
I
would
it.
then
I'm with you.
obviously take that further. So this is, you know, quite loose. There's a lot of stuff that is unresolved in this, but the bones are there. And so then I would then take this a little bit further. And it's still, you know, a fair bit of kind of sketching happening here. There are some choices going on where, like, do we like the goggles on the head, or do we like the goggles on the face? Things like that we can kind of show a little bit. Do we like this one's a little bit more direct kind of reference to Cyberpunk, the haircut and everything else. So that might not be something that you would go for, because you and your legal team would look at that and be like, excuse me, that's a bit too close to the current like Cyberpunk game. So maybe we go for something like this. Or, you know what, I really don't like the geisha hair. I don't mind the Japanese influence a little bit, but full on geisha is just not cutting it for me. I don't necessarily like the jacket, so I would just keep making these like changes to this.
So you're basically keeping like the base illustration, like the structure of it, not changing that too much, but you're adding like just different kind of aesthetic like styles to it, just iterating on different things, like adding accessories, maybe changing the hair, all that sort of thing, just to see what kind of lands in the second round of feedback.
Totally.
Yeah,
totally. And this is where like I can spend a fair bit of time, and it's a super fun process to do, but it can also be very time consuming if you don't have those kind of like guardrails to keep you on brief, in a sense, because this is like the character customization panel in any like good RPG, where you spend hours and hours and hours like going through all the permutations of like, what if it was this nose with these eyes and this hairdo, and
you're making me flash back to Skyrim, like the first time I played Skyrim, and I think just making the character for like 4 hours.
Yeah, so this is that kind of idea. And often what I'll do is I'll do a layer for the basic pose, and then I'll come in with another layer and another color and start sort of looking at like, you know, okay, so she's got a t-shirt on now, and it's like a crop top t-shirt, and it just kind of sits here, and on the back of the t-shirt is a big number. How does that look? Make it kind of like a sports just kind of shirt. Is that cool? Then we give her like, you know, big kind of spiky neck, like bracelets, make it a bit more cyberpunk. How does the hairdo kind of work? Do we give her like this kind of shaved head? I like the idea of the shaved head, or the partly shaved head, because it allows you for a little bit more kind of detail, like implants going into the side of the brain. That kind of stuff can be quite cool. And then the Japanese influence can just come from a few little details. Like there's varying levels of flavor that we can put in there. There's also this idea of like reference versus plagiarism. So something like this is probably starting to get a little bit of trouble from the makers of CD Projekt Red and other games like this, because this is starting to be quite close to their promos of their main character. But at the same time, a game like CD Projekt Red is actually getting their influences from another place as well. So
Right.
there are tropes.
There's like
the
Akira
kind of the shape.
vibes and like other,
Yeah,
Cyberpunk's been around for a long time. So yeah, that does get very
100%.
interesting.
These kind of things on the side of the head, they're not like, CD Projekt Red were not the first people to do something like this. Um, so it's also like a combination of things, right? So like on this one, I think you could probably get away with something like that because the sleeves have been made into a bit of a kimono, the design on the background, the hair is different. There's a lot of differences here. It's not just the jacket anymore, whereas this is like the hair plus the jacket plus the kind of the eye, like face, like mechanization or whatever it is. That's starting to really be like, okay, that's very, very close to what these guys would do. So that's kind of no bueno on something like this. So yeah, I would literally just kind of, play around with a whole range of different things and like mix it up and see what looks good, what doesn't look good, give her a kind of different style of goggles. And that can kind of be an interesting thing. And this is also where
getting
like
more towards like steampunk with the
goggles. Yeah, totally.
Hey, I've got a question from Johanna, which I think is a great question for this kind of thing. Would you ever set yourself a timer for initial thumbnails and later iterations to keep track of how much time you're spending on a given concept?
No, not really. It's a good question, and it's something that definitely a lot of people will do. Either just to keep track of time on something like this, just to obviously be able to then like give a clearer invoice estimate or know how fast or how slow you've been working on something. But I wouldn't necessarily set a timer for each sketch. I'm not sure if that's actually what you're asking. Simply because like for me, it's just like the thing is done when it's done.
Right.
And if I feel like sometimes at this level is at least when I'm doing these guys, I don't like to spend too much time on. But when I'm doing something like this, like you can start to get quite deep into these ideas of like, what are we doing here? What's this going to look like? How's it going to work? All that kind of stuff. So I don't necessarily like to just be like, oh, time's up on this sketch, move on. Because like, well, no, I want to keep working on this.
Keep going. You're just going to press the snooze button.
Yeah. So it's not like I don't not do it because I think it's a stupid idea. I think it's a great idea to do it. And there's a lot of valuable information to be had from knowing how much time it takes you to do the work. For future references or invoices or any of those kind of things, it's absolutely invaluable. But I don't necessarily like to limit myself in that sense when I'm doing this stage, at least.
So you've been doing your thing for a long time. For people out there that are just learning, do you think it would be a helpful exercise, or would you suggest against it?
I would suggest to do it, but mostly for this idea, like I said, not so much to like make sure that you don't get too bogged down on something. Like definitely when you're doing stage one, you want to keep it loose. You want to do a little bit more. It's more kind of quantity than quality at this stage. When you're here, it's a little bit more about the quality and the figuring out of the thing. This is where all the kind of the concept work kind of happens. But I would still recommend it, mostly because, like I said, what it will do is it will give you an idea of whether you are fast or slow. And so when a client comes to you, for instance, and says, we need like 16 illustrations for next week, you know whether or not that's realistic for you to do or not. Because you know, like, you know what, I tend to take a little bit more time, and that's fine. That doesn't mean that you should be charging less. It just means that you need to plan your timing a little bit better and so forth. So it becomes this thing. Like I know from experience that I tend to work relatively fast, just because clients have more often than not gone like, oh, you're done already. Okay, cool. That's awesome. So I know that if there's a brief that comes in with a relatively tight deadline, I'm not too scared to say yes. Simply because I know that I'll be able to kind of figure it out and work to that deadline within reason, obviously. But so yeah, keeping track of how much time you spend on something is definitely valuable information for sure, because it just allows you to be a little bit clearer on something like that. and when you're quoting and invoicing, or even taking on the brief and then making that decision as to, do I take this on or not? Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. I was actually going to ask this question as well. Just very quickly. But Johanna asked another question. How do you go about developing a shorthand/reference library for thumbnails when it comes to clothing and non-figure related aspects of it? So yeah, like, you know, you're very quick. You're very quickly like adding all these things that me personally, I would definitely need to reference. Like, obviously that comes from experience. But yeah, do you have like a library in your head of things that you know work? Yeah. Okay.
Well, I've got a library in my head. Because I've got a library online that I keep sourcing. So I use like Pinterest just for like various boards as well. And I'll have like like I've got a manga board. I've got like an 80s board. I've got a Japanese board for all Japanese kind of references of what like a kimono looks like. Or
I feel like you'd have like hundreds of thousands. You'd have like the ultimate like manga board.
Oh man, like yeah, I've got quite a bit happening in there. Yeah. And so a lot of these things, like a lot of what I've just drawn here without any reference, is stuff that I've already drawn somewhat to a certain degree, like the super high collar jacket, or the crop top jacket, or the geisha hairdo. Like that's me kind of having done this, you know, like 50 to 60 times before. So now that's in my brain.
Yeah.
But if I was to try and do something a little bit different, then yeah, I'd have to definitely look at it. It also helps to, you know, like I've done these kind of like Splinter Cell kind of like goggles on something like this, like just because I've kind of done something like this before. But don't be afraid, even if you think you know what something looks like, it can be really cool and very handy to look at references of different things, because it can be like, oh, you know what, I'd never thought about putting like a little like antenna on something like this, and that's pretty cool. Or like maybe there's like one of those phone cords that attaches to like a battery pack that's on the backpack, or any of those kind of things that you might not necessarily think of because you get these mannerisms. So there's definitely a balance of like your brain says, I know how to do this, I'm not going to look at reference, when maybe you should, versus like if you're constantly stopping to go online and find what does this look like, it's going to slow you down a little bit. So over time you obviously build habits, and you build a certain visual library. If you're working in a similar style, quite often you will know kind of what you're doing a little bit better, and you'll be able to just pull it out of your head without necessarily having to kind of reference it too much. But definitely for something like this, for instance, where she's kind of winking, that's easy to do. But trying to do this idea of like she's got a lollipop in her mouth, like, okay, I might need reference for that. I might, and if I can't find it online, I will get my partner to do this, and then I'll photograph it and I'll use that as reference.
Right.
Which is something that you see a lot of animators do a lot of the time, where they've got a mirror in front of them for facial expressions, and then they'll do the expression and draw it from that. You're just using yourself as reference. So that's always incredibly handy, because otherwise it might just look like she's smoking a cigarette or something, which, you know, again, you got to consider these kind of legal things for that kind of stuff. Like maybe it's not okay if the game is rated not R or PG. You don't, if it's a game more for like children, you obviously don't want your main character smoking on the cover of the game. That's not the thing that you want to send out. So you need to make sure that you're not drawing the wrong thing. Yeah, exactly. Smoking your cigar inside your helmet.
Inside your helmet.
Yeah. All right. So from here, what are we feeling? Number 1, number 2, or number 3?
So I'm being the client over here, aren't I? Okay.
Yeah. I'm suggesting
2. Yeah.
This one. I'm influencing you to pick this one, but again, at the end of the day, this is what the client. This is the client's decision.
Yeah.
Right. And trying to figure that out is up to them. So with this, we've got. We can start kind of working on something like this now. A question that will come up, which I forgot to ask at the beginning, and at this stage is not necessarily the end of the world, but it's definitely something you want to ask potentially before you start working on something like this, which is, what's the format of this file? I.e., do you want is it going to be vector? Do you need a vector illustration? Or is it like, what is it, an A3? Is it an A4? If I'm working in Photoshop, like, what are you going to print this at, right?
Yeah.
Because I'll need to work on that. So if I'm working in Illustrator, that's not so much of an issue because it's all vector, so it's scalable. But if I'm working in Photoshop, I need to give you the file at size. And so now that I'm ready to work on the actual final file that I will deliver for you, that's a question that will inevitably come up. But it's a question that I should have asked you to begin with, and that's my bad.
Right.
The difference here is, for instance, like if I'm doing all of this, like I'm not great at Illustrator, for instance. Like I don't feel confident to do an illustration like this in Illustrator. Somebody like Alex Lahuz might, or Dale, might be more confident doing something like this. But if I had known, for instance, if I had asked that question, or if you had told me from the start, I need a vector file, and I like this illustration, I might actually have turned down the job because I can't do this in Illustrator, and you need that Illustrator file. So it is definitely a question that you should ask before getting too deep into a brief, or into a brief at all, potentially, simply because it will dictate how the file will look. Are you going to work with an animator on this? So I've got a brief going at the moment where I'm working with an animator, and they're requesting things like, we want to make her wink and we want the arm to move. So can we have the whole of the arm drawing on a separate layer so that we can animate that in After Effects or whatever else? So all these things do matter.
And they probably want that as vector, right? Do they want that as vector, or are they happy just to have them as separate, like, I don't know.
Look, 9 times out of 10, if you're working for like branding or any other kind of industry like that, where that's going to go on a packaging which is going to be vector, they're going to ask for vector, 100%. But if you're working if you know, for instance, that you're only going to work onto a game box, like this is only going to go on a game box, you're not going to print posters because you don't have the budget or whatever other reason, you could definitely do this as a PSD. The default, I think, is for clients to ask for vector, because I think that's just the standard.
And they just know, no matter how much they know about design, they might just know that, well, I know that if I get a vector, then I can scale it, and why wouldn't I get that?
Yeah, and if we change our mind down the track and we like it and we want to change it to something else, then like, yeah, let's do vector. But I often will come back to the client and go, all right, well, why do you need vector? Like, what are you actually using this for? And do you actually need vector? Because I'd love to take on this brief for you, but I'm not the person to do it if it's going to be vector. So what are you actually intending on using it as? And can it be a PSD file? And more often than not, the client will come back and be like, oh yeah, that's fine, it could be a PSD. I think it's just that the reflex is to go, get a vector file.
Yeah, totally. So we've got about 7 minutes left, just as a by the way, and we'll be back with part 2 on Thursday, everybody, as well.
Okay, so I've made a new document now, and we've got an A2. Sometimes I like to do this where it's just like, you know what, you've only asked for like an A5, but I'm going to do this at A2 just in case.
A5.
It's kind of
I think I would have asked for A3. I think
potentially, yeah. If you're doing poster, if you're doing game box art, like
this big, like postcard.
Yeah, it's pretty small, but it's probably I don't know exactly what the size of a game box art is, but anyways, I've got an A2 here for you. It's that orientation, and so what I will literally do now is take this and stick it in here, and obviously it's a lot smaller because my sketch file is not gigantic. And we are kind of good to go. Now, the other thing that I will maybe kind of think about at this stage is, do we have title? Like, do we have some text to include in here where we're going to add in the title of your game, like Ellipse Online, and where's that going to go? Does that go up here? And then do we have like these little bits and pieces here that I quite like doing on something? This is kind of tantamount more to graphic design now, but it can be super fun to add these kind of things. It gives it that kind of cyberpunk vibe.
Yeah, and if they're printing a box, there's like, certain things that they might have to print, like down the bottom or up the top, depending on the country and
the rating
sort of
and all these different kind of things. So it's good to kind of think about that as well and get those files from the client as soon as possible, so that you can kind of work that in. And then sometimes I also like to kind of just do a frame inside the frame, so that it's like it obviously allows you to kind of cut the illustration off in a sense, but it then also allows me to kind of crop it out of that, and that gives it a little bit more kind of dynamic feeling to it. So from here, there's still a little bit of figuring out to do on this illustration, and not everything's been kind of detailed, but I'm happy to kind of move forward on this and potentially start inking. So next week, we're going to start looking at, not next week, sorry, on Thursday.
Yep.
I will start inking this up, and I will kind of start talking about using my library. So I've got a library of a whole bunch of different like stickers and things that I created in Illustrator that I can literally just kind of drag and drop into here. And that allow me to kind of do like cyberpunk or like, heads up display kind of elements, which doesn't have anything in it yet. Or Japanese things, like if I want to put, something like this on her back, I can kind of stick that there, and then we can start working from that and give it that kind of feeling that I'm looking for.
Oh, cool.
So that'll be Thursday, day after tomorrow, and we'll look at kind of finishing this off and talking a little bit about using kind of Illustrator and libraries and kind of a few little different tips and tricks on how to do this kind of cyberpunky, techie vibe of an illustration.
That's cool. I really like the use of libraries, like for those common things that you need to do all the time. I think it's something that we all, like designers and illustrators, basically anyone that's using this stuff, should invest time in. Like it's such a time saver, 100%. Right? Like when you're working on like a real project, proper project where it's quoted and everything. We were talking about time management before, and I think it is such a huge time saver. I'm pretty good at using it for like Adobe projects and, the podcasts that we do as well. I've got all my library set up, and then I find that I haven't touched it for other projects. And I always kick myself and I think, man, I've like gone through my Dropbox to find like these logos and these colors and all this sort of stuff so many times now. I wish I spent the, 10 minutes setting everything up to just keep everything within the app. Would have been a lot easier.
Yeah, and you get all your assets and they're just ready to go, and it makes so much more sense. Yeah. Well, cool. So that'll be on Thursday.
That's awesome. Well, I hope you guys learnt something from that. I hope I hope that was valuable. I saw a bunch of people in chat saying it was valuable, so I'm really glad. We are going to be jumping into part 2 on Thursday. It's 10 o'clock we're starting Sydney time. I'm not sure what time that is wherever you are, but it's a half an hour later start than today was, if that is helpful at all to you. Great to see some of you in chat. We hope you have a wonderful week, and we hope that you can join us on Thursday. Thank you, Jeremy.
Tiny last little thing. Don't forget to save as well.
Don't forget to save. Did you save it all during that, or just that?
I saved it just then. Yeah.
Just then.
So just remember to save.
There we go. Remember to save, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you on Thursday. Thanks, Jeremy.
Yep. See you guys. Thank you.